Welcome. Thank you for coming. And we apologize in advance for what short notice it was, but I'm so glad you got the notice and you showed up in such encouraging numbers for such a short notice invitation. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this discussion on European security for the 21st century, featuring Jüri Luik, Minister of Defense of Estonia. With the American baseball season beginning tomorrow, you're going to start hearing all these baseball metaphors. So let me tell you, Jüri Luik has touched all the bases that you need to have this conversation. He's a former foreign minister. He now is Defense Minister of Estonia for the third time. He served as Estonia's ambassador to the United States and also Estonia's ambassador to the Russian Federation. He also led talks leading to the withdrawal of Russian troops from Estonia in 1994 and finalized negotiations over the Estonia-Russia border agreement in 2014. Only 6 of NATO's 29 countries have met the goal of devoting at least 2% of GDP to defense, and Estonia's percentage is 2.15%. US and European allies are holding an important NATO summit in Brussels in July, and Estonia is at the forefront of major questions of European security. May I note finally, with some personal pleasure, that Mr. Luik embarked on his distinguished career with a degree in journalism. So please join me in welcoming to IPI Jüri Luik, the Defense Minister of Estonia.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction. Very happy to be here. And let me start with an introduction in broad brushes, and then I think we'll continue with questions and answers so we can zero in on issues which are of great interest to you. Talking about European security, we are obviously talking about several conflict zones in Europe and in its vicinity. Russia's aggression in Ukraine, brutal war in Syria, various conflicts to the south and to the Mediterranean. European security is influenced by migration flows, a problem that has been exacerbated by international conflicts and humanitarian crises. The global influence of the Western value space, based on democracy, market economy, rule of law, and human rights, is decreasing, and ideological opposition to it is increasing all over the world. We are seeing increasing assertiveness of powers which do not adhere to Western values. Cyberspace has transformed human interaction and become a part of global human development. It has also now become a global political and military battleground. We are seeing how information and communication technology and media can be used even more effectively to influence people. Manipulating with the spreading of false information is widely used, also on state level, to escalate conflicts. It has created tensions in international relations, caused radicalization, and harmed the cohesion of societies. The number and severity of these attacks is ever increasing, and the perpetrators of more sophisticated attacks are supported and often directed by state actors. European security is affected by Russia's increasing military activity and aggressive behavior. There's no doubt that for Estonia, Russia remains one of the most complicated challenges and one of the most complicated neighbors. Russia is a risk to our security, to the security of Estonia, and to the security of Europe at large. Let me say a couple of words about Russia. I think we are living at a very important stage of the development of Russia's relationship with Europe. you have seen that the latest wave of expulsions of Russian diplomats/spies has been an unequivocal signal to the Russian leadership that they cannot go on like that in their policy of interference to the affairs of other sovereign countries. I think Russia was given benefit of the doubt for a very long time. Basically, there was a huge reservoir of goodwill, and some of the separate moves which were undertaken by our Russian neighbors were not seen in context. They were not seen as part of the Russia's general concept of the world and their general approach to foreign policy. Now, more and more, we are able to connect the dots. And it is obvious that if there wouldn't have been Georgia, we perhaps wouldn't have been so clear about Ukraine. If there wouldn't have been Litvinenko, we perhaps wouldn't be so clear when it comes to events in Salisbury. So Russia itself has developed this swell of negativity in its relationship with the West, clearly using that to prop up the regime internally. But on the other hand, of course, when you do it, you become hostage of your own internal policy. You cannot stop anymore. You continue, and the events then can spiral out of control. So it is extremely important that the world community would maintain a very clear-eyed approach when it comes to Russia. And it is also extremely important for a small country like Estonia. We can go deeper into the Russian issues, sort of drawing on my experience, as you pointed out, Estonian ambassador to Russia. I was there from 2013 till 2015, so it was during the Crimea and East Ukrainian aggression. For a small country like Estonia, international law and rules-based international order is, of course, a crucial part of both our identity, but also of our protection. So for that, we very much credit the work of the United Nations. And I'm happy to say that although being a very small country, we'll do our bit in be as active as possible in UN matters. And an area which is under my responsibility is, of course, defense. I'll be speaking today on peacekeeping issues in a debate, but I'm happy to report to you that Estonia participates in various stabilization missions all around the world, and our biggest mission nowadays, biggest by numbers, is actually in UNIFIL in South Lebanon. So it indeed is a peacekeeping mission. Although we have other missions, including missions of a more, how should I say, kind of shooting nature as well. But peacekeeping is an important part of our defense, and it is an important part of our activities. Two of the very important pillars of stability for Estonia are obviously NATO and the European Union. Both organizations are not sort of inertious blocks. They are developing as we speak. They are responding to the political, economic, and military challenges. And that's why Estonia always tries to be in the inner core of those powerful organizations, because this is the best way we can influence the events inside the organization or directing the policy of those two organizations. When it comes to NATO, then NATO has opened up a serious collective defense mission in Eastern Europe and has stationed troops to several Eastern European countries, Northern European countries, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And in Estonian case, these are British/French or British/Danish troops on our soil. And this is an important move by the alliance, looking from our point of view, not to induce war, not to provoke war, but on the contrary, to avoid war. Because I think the biggest achievement of NATO as an alliance was that it enabled the world to avoid at least the big war during what we now call the Cold War. Although there were wars all around the world, but we didn't see the really big one. And I think NATO should be credited for that. But for Estonia, there is a rule of thumb, which is that our security is dependent on the security of our allies and dependent on the security of the whole region, taken broadly. Estonia is participating in many operations which are further from our shores, if you will. The latest one, Estonia will join the French-led operation Barkhane, which is operating on the territories of various Sahel countries. And this is our way of emphasizing that the sudden flank, if you will, or the sudden direction for Europe is also of great importance to us. Again, we are a very small country, so our military contributions cannot be massive. They probably won't make a difference in strategic, from the strategic point of view, but they are certainly important in building up this paradigm of security as we see it. Now, European Union is a very multifaceted organization, and in the community of defense ministers, there's always this debate whether the new EU defense pillar somehow overshadows what is happening in NATO, which remains the primary defense organization in Europe. And I don't think that's the case. I believe EU was created for entirely different reasons. EU is a political project, economic, social, educational project, and foreign policy, and especially defense, is only one fraction of EU developments. So the likelihood that it will start to overshadow other organizations on that domain is I think, very unlikely. On the other hand, Estonia last year, the end of last year, had the presidency of the European Union, and one of the key pillars of our presidency was to develop EU defense dimension, because it's clear that EU has its own identity and it has issues to do with defense which EU nations want to address. So responding to that demand, we looked at how and what the EU can actually do to help European security. There have been glorious attempts to build an European Defence Union starting from 1948, in fact, preceding NATO. They have always failed, and there are always reasons for that. One of the reasons has always also been that they have been too ambitious. They haven't been responding to the real capabilities which the European Union has. We have basically bluffed ourselves out of business in that environment. I think now the attempt we are undertaking is much more practical, concrete, and it is based on the strengths of the European Union, like economic development, industrial policy, etc., etc. So one of the first areas of cooperation will be building new defensive capabilities for our armed forces. I'm not only talking about weapons, I'm talking about various types of equipment, programming, etc., etc. That is sort of half industrial policy, half defense policy. EU also has a small sort of, it's not a standing unit, but it is a quick reaction unit. The battle group, it's called a battle group. Unfortunately, the EU has never sent out this battle group. And again, there are reasons for that. The battle group at the moment is not organizational nor militarily viable. And it should be propped up so that it would be usable both for EU operations, for United Nations operations, and other international operations if need be. This is something, this is a work in progress. This is something we are continuing as we speak. But again, we have to keep in mind that the EU's military capacity will always be relatively small and will never make a decisive impact, neither in the European security nor in the security at large, but it can add value to certain particular operations, and these are easily operations which could be also under the UN flag. And finally, about cyberspace. Now, I already mentioned in my expose how important cyber has become in our everyday life and also in the security domain. If you think in your head, you count the hours, how long in a day, say, sort of in the part of the day where you are awake, you spend in cyberspace, or you work in cyberspace, then this always gives a much better understanding to everybody of how important this domain has become. And it has been decided now in an organization where we belong to, which is Nato, to recognize that cyber has become an operational domain, which means that this is a domain which has the likelihood of a need of having conduct the military operations or defensive operations of certain kind. So there are 5 battle spaces now, if you will. It's sea, land, air, space, and cyber. Obviously, cyber attack is the most complicated of attacks. There are various reasons for that. One is that it is very hard to recognize. I mean, you can easily misinterpret it for something else. It has no pre-warning. I mean, if you are afraid that tanks would come in your way, there are certain indicators which are viewed as pretty certain signals that the conventional attack is about to start. In cyberspace, there's nothing like that. Major attack can go on as we speak. Since the cyberspace and cyber technologies and cyber programming is an ever-evolving materia, then the events, the critical cyber events can be unpredictable in a way that neither the methods nor the protocol cannot be sort of pre-understood, if you will. When we speak about a conventional battle, there are usually patterns which we can draw upon when we build up our own defense. We know how an attack with conventional forces will influence us, so we can build the defenses. In cyberspace, it's all much more fluid. So it's very difficult to have proper plans to counter those threats. And of course, which is very important, I mean, cyber knows no borders. It knows no borders of countries. It knows no borders of international organizations. So attempts different international bodies to address it separately are doomed to failure. And perhaps this is one of the most challenging issues that we could build up a protocol by which different bodies can really work together and help each other. Unfortunately, or fortunately, cyber defense cooperation is very much built on trust, because the information which you share with your allies and your supporters is often extremely sensitive. That's why we have to keep in mind that this cooperation involves a high level of trusting your friends, high level of trusting your partner organizations. And that's also the reason why most of these collective efforts have failed so far. So this is a huge work still to be done. I think I'll conclude here. Thank you for your attention, and we'll go on with the discussion.
Come, Tim. I want to ask you a question, actually, that's particularly about Estonia, and it comes out of some of your remarks this morning when you said that for too long Europeans gave Russia the benefit of the doubt, and now, and really right now, you see some of the countries that are sending diplomats home are countries which have some illiberal traditions going on in their own countries right now, and yet they realize this threat is serious, and they're pulling their ambassadors, sending them home, sending Russian ambassadors out. The question I wanted to ask you is, a couple of years ago, we have a program here, we're bringing writers of big international books here, and a writer, you might know her name is Agnia Griga. She's a Lithuanian-American based in Washington, and she wrote a book called Beyond Crimea. And in that book, she wrote about something called, that I'm sure you know about, called compatriot protection, whereby Russia will identify those countries, and they tend to be heavily Baltic countries, where there is a substantial Russian population. These are countries that once were part of the Soviet Union. These are Russian speakers with, and Russia will say they are a minority in their home country, and we must protect them, compatriot protection. In light of what you said now about Europe kind of waking up to the threat that Russia might represent, you have a substantial number of Russian speakers in Estonia. Do they represent a body of political thought that is sympathetic, more sympathetic to Russia than other Estonians? And do they complicate Estonia's relationship with Russia? Well, let me ask you the other way. Have the Russians tried to exploit their presence there to agitate sort of against Estonia?
I would say not really. And the reason is that they are pretty well aware in Moscow that the Russian speakers who live on our territory, and this is not a united bloc of that people who speak Russian, they somehow have common political views and common political attitudes. This is a very diverse group of people, both regionally, age-wise, in terms of their interests, and they are not usable in a way that perhaps a Moscow ideologue would like them to be used. So this proposition, while theoretically understandable, in practical terms, is not available for Russians, for Russian propaganda and for Russian subversive effort. On the contrary, I mean, there are Russian speakers everywhere in the Estonian society, in high places, both in politics, in military, in other spheres of life. So I would say that the understanding that they would somehow turn against their own country, against their own government, is from my point of view, totally untrue and simply impossible, if you will. And this is not only about Estonia, you know. I would say that this pretext is always used in eastern Ukraine. But what you see actually happening in eastern Ukraine is not a conflict based on ethnicity and not a conflict based on what language you speak. In fact, on both sides of the control line or administrative line in eastern Ukraine, the units often are both Russian speakers. But what Russia has done and how the conflict was started was that it brought in small groups of special forces, which then indicated the width of territory Russians wanted to control in the beginning. The war started from special forces. There were some of the famous Russian quote-unquote heroes who took on the first cities in Ukraine, for instance, a city called Slavyansk, which became famous in this Russian campaign. So a lot of the ethnic aspect has been later designed by the Russian mainstream media because it's their bread and butter. That's what they do.
I wanted to ask you about that, go all the way the other direction to conventional military right now. You have that EU force that you mentioned, UK-led with French and Danish contributions. They're only, I think, 100 miles from the Russian border. I wanted to ask you about something that I know you know about and can talk about with some interest, which is the frozen jungle, fighting wars in forests, because I think it's true that Estonia probably has the last forest in Europe. Are there some special aspects of fighting in that kind of terrain that Estonia is teaching the other Europeans?
Well, broadly, it's how you would fight in a cold forest, basically, as some of our southern allies call it, cold jungle. Mm-hmm. We were surprised to find out, although it's logical when you think about it, that in Western Europe, there are no forests as such. And the forests which still are there are more kind of park forests, if you will. So the units which are European units usually go to get battle training in forest conditions in Canada. They actually take their tanks and ship them to Canada to do forest fighting training for armored vehicles, which is quite a complicated science because armored vehicles like tanks are heavy, and in conditions in the forests you can easily get stuck or there are other risks involved. So I would say that this kind of training in difficult conditions in forest landscapes, this is something we can teach to our allies. And people are really interested in it because they have never actually experienced it properly.
We had the pleasure a week or 10 days ago of having as a guest at IPI the current Norwegian foreign minister, who, as you know, is a former defense minister, Ina Eriksen Søreide. And there was a little conversation about defense capabilities in the Arctic. And I wanted to ask you about that. Finland, Norway, Sweden, the Baltic states. Is there now air defense in the Arctic area, or is that something that's going to have to be produced by other people like the United States?
Well, it very much depends on what type of air defense we are talking about, because if we talk about sort of low to medium range, then Norwegians themselves have those capabilities. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are lacking medium-range air defense. And this is something the allies have to provide in times of crisis. But many, many other countries in the region have quite sophisticated capabilities. Now, it's true that in Western armies, air defense has always or often been an overlooked capacity because the post-Cold War understanding of how you fight the war was that you always have what is called air superiority, because you have fighters which can take out all targets on air. So you don't need to develop your air defense capabilities. That was not the Russian approach. Russians, in fact, have developed very sophisticated air defense capabilities which can be absolutely equal to their Western counterparts. And this is part of the Russian strategy, which is called A2AD, Area Access Denial Strategy, which means that you try to close air, sea, and land space in your immediate vicinity. And you make it extremely difficult for allies to move in, for instance, to the Baltic states to help us. So this kind of tactic needs very sophisticated air defense capabilities, because you are sort of fighting against a very high-tech opponent who has very high-end planes. And Russians have certainly taken that into consideration, and our capabilities are not on that level.
Well, speaking of the difficulty of moving assets around Europe, you have discovered, have you not, that actually deployment of armies in Europe run up against border controls. I think at one point you said there's maybe a need for a military Schengen. Could you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I mean, it is obvious that when somebody moves a column of tanks through your territory, you want to know about it. And there is quite a sophisticated system of permits. If, for instance, the Brits who are on the Estonian territory, if they are moving an echelon of military equipment towards Estonia, and they do it by land, not by sea, then a number of permits, diplomatic clearances, etc., have to be applied. And this is usual. I mean, there's no arguing with that. The problem is that it takes a lot of time. The governments take a lot of time in making those decisions, whether to allow them through or not to allow them through. And of course, it is absurd when we are talking about the allies. I mean, basically, we are allies in Europe who are committed to each other's defense, according to NATO's Article 5. So why is it so difficult to move military equipment in peacetime, for instance, for exercise purposes? And European Union has now decided to address this issue. For those who are not perhaps familiar with the intricacies of NATO and European Union, I will tell you this is a huge thing, because everybody understands that EU doesn't have any military units as such. So everything EU does in that domain is really, at least at the beginning, meant more for helping NATO. And usually NATO and EU have been in a very complicated relationship because of political conflicts of various member states. And now this is sort of easing up, and there are new projects coming to the forefront. And this project on military mobility is one of those. For instance, there is a plan now on the table that every allied country should give clearance to, say, an echelon or a column from other allied country within 5 days. I mean, you have to make this decision in 5 days. In government bureaucracy, when you talk about moving tanks, through your highways or railways, 5 days is actually quite a small time, quite a short time. So this is a challenging project, but we'll be moving forward with it.
I want to ask you one last thing before we go to the room, and that gets back to cybersecurity. We were talking earlier, and I was saying that a couple of nights ago I was up at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I mentioned that you were coming, and I said Estonia, and you say Estonia, and right away people say, oh, they're the experts in cyber attacks, in cyber crime, they're wired, and ironically, you have become experts because you were, I think it's fair to say, the first victim of a state-sponsored cyber attack 11 years ago, which we assume came from Russia. And also, in a funny way, you have the second dubious distinction of having been more harassed by Russia than other European countries in the past. So you've become sort of specialist in how to handle that also. How did Estonia react to that attack 11 years ago, which completely sort of incapacitated your society for a brief period? And is it fair to say that you have turned that to your advantage by learning an awful lot about cyber attacks, so much so that a group of people at the Council on Foreign Relations will say they're the experts in that subject?
Yeah, in a way, this first attack by Russia towards Estonia was a very crude attack, a simple and crude attack. The dubious sort of advantage of it was that it was the first one, and it was kind of a signal to everybody that.
Can I just recall for the audience, I think this happened, I think it's fair to say it happened because of a decision by Estonia to move a statue of a Soviet general from a central part of Tallinn to, I think, the side of a cemetery or something. I remember hearing Russian diplomats here at the...
To a military cemetery, yeah.
Oh, military, okay. Mm-hmm. And that provoked that attack, excuse me.
From our point of view, it was really more of a pretext to that attack. But the fact was the attack took place, and of course it was a signal to all of us. And we have also, and this is very important, we have also been developing our country from the get-go by using a lot of cyber tools for civilian benefit. In fact, our countries, our societies' everyday operating system is based very much on cyber, public services, for instance. But also, we do something which I think no other country does in the world, which is we run elections. There's a possibility to make your election choice via internet. Now, for that, you need a very secure and complicated system of identifying basically the person who is making the choice, so that it is a real person and it is an Estonian citizen who makes that choice. It's a very complicated system. But all those systems make Estonia also vulnerable and make Estonia a target. So it has forced us to develop cyber defense capabilities, both in a civilian realm and also in a military realm. And in our case, this is pretty precisely divided. I mean, for instance, the Ministry of Defense deals only with military aspects of cyber defense. And we have the Ministry of Economy who deals with the whole civilian infrastructure and other civilian parts, which is the majority of the everyday work of the society with those issues. So it's a pretty neat division in our case. Some countries do it differently. For instance, Lithuania has decided that most of its cyber defense capabilities are under the Ministry of Defense, which gives that ministry, of course, then a major role in those activities.
Excellent. I'd love to get some questions and comments from the floor. If you'd raise your hand, I'll call on you. And please, I'm going to ask you to stand up because we're webcasting this and the camera's in the back. Please identify yourself and we'll get a microphone to you. Why don't we start with this gentleman here?
Yes,
Well, wait for the microphone's right there.
yes, okay. Good morning, sir. Thank you very much. I am Brigadier General Thierry Lyon from France, and I had the honor to command an Estonian contingent in Central African Republic. It was the first contingent in the European force, so I just would like to thank you another time for that. At the same moment, it was the Crimea affairs, and you were the first country, a European country, coming in Africa for us. So another time, thank you. My question is, your focus, of course, on the Russian cyber attacks. I can understand that very well. But what about today, the organized crime, the jihadists who can activate people everywhere in the world as a tool, as an attack, like in France 1 week ago, but like in other countries everywhere in the world. So I can understand that Russian or another country is a main threat. But what about all these people in the world that you can reactivate just with one mail? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your leadership in that particular Central Africa operation, which indeed was the first one for us on that continent. When it comes to cyber risks, then I mainly focused on purely defensive aspects. But you are absolutely right. I mean, when we speak more broadly, then perhaps the biggest risk nowadays is the hybrid risk of A, cyber, and B, propaganda. Sort of you bind them two together and you get a very potent weapon. I mean, for instance, you can steal somebody's emails with the cyber tools. It is a relatively simple operation, and many people outside the government or not connected to government can do it. But how to use this information, how to weaponize this information, there you need expertise. Otherwise, these are just emails. You have to know how to publish it, where to publish it, what context you will put to these emails. Then it becomes a serious hit to your opponent. And that is something which can be directed by governments or by organizations, also terror organizations, some of them being very capable when it comes to cyber. Or, as you say, recruitment or activization of your supporters. These are all very potent and credible ways to exercise a cyber weapon. But then it's more kind of a hybrid weapon, whereby you use, as I said, many different tools simultaneously. When you talk about defense, when you go after, for instance, cryptid systems, when you go after weapons, communication systems, then you usually have to have government support because it is very, very expensive. I mean, one person with a computer, this kind of movie-style thing that a guy sits on his bedroom and just enters takes the nuclear codes, or I don't know what. This is the realism or likelihood of that is here. You need a lot of server capabilities, you need a lot of knowledge, a lot of financing, and the governments really are the only ones who have that capability. But it's important to keep in mind that we have not yet seen a major cyber attack in a way of one government or one country hitting the other with all the available cyber weapons. We have seen attempts to be prepared for such an attack. For instance, the intrusion of special malware to the electricity grid here in the United States, whereby you prepare slowly, step by step, your capability towards such an attack. But you don't actually complete that attack, and the reason is that you know that your own systems are also very vulnerable to that kind of thing. So you are prone to be much more cautious when it comes to the kind of total wide range cyber battle, if you will.
I just want to ask you something off of the general's question, then we'll get to other questions. And that is, it occurred to me that when you meet with your counterparts from Southern Europe, they have a problem with jihadism and terrorism that I imagine you do not have in Norway. But do you have a problem with that in Norway? Excuse me. I'm thinking last week. Last week was Norway. This week it's Estonia.
Well, we haven't had any incidents, but certainly in this period of open borders, Schengen, I mean, people are moving freely, and we have had terror attacks by jihadists in Finland. We have had them several times in Sweden, so they have been very, very close to Estonian shores. So we don't believe that we are somehow immune to these events. Perhaps we have simply been lucky.
I have a question in the front row here.
Thank you very much. Sarah Taylor from IPI. Thank you so much for the comments and insight into cybersecurity. I'd like to come back to sort of the more traditional peacekeeping and the multilateral work that you discussed in your statements. And as you noted, you'll be speaking on peacekeeping later today here at the UN Security Council. A big push at the last peacekeeping summits in Canada and the UK has been increasing the participation of women. I do believe that Estonia has at least several women who are deployed via your contributions to UN peacekeeping. I'm wondering if you can speak from your experience as a TCC, PCC about the efforts that you're making to increase that participation, what that looks like, and if you're thinking about that increase in participation in your efforts in cybersecurity as well. Thank you.
I mean, it's an excellent question because I mean, part and parcel of peacekeeping is also to increase the participation of women in the force. I cannot tell you the exact numbers because they are not in my fingertips, but that's part of our policy, and they are of course doing a fabulous job in peacekeeping. And I even don't have this feeling that I should kind of compare it, why women are better than men or men better than women. I think everybody in our force is doing an excellent job, and I think it is true that the availability of being a military has been tilted towards men for a very long time, and that must be changed, and that is something we are actually doing. When it comes to the challenges, perhaps in more general terms, then of course one of the important aspects which has been discussed thoroughly also is the cultural sensitivity. We are operating, as I said, in Lebanon, we're operating in Afghanistan, we are now going to Mali. There's no doubt that the position of women in those societies, particularly in Afghanistan and in Mali, is very different from what we are used to. So I think it's very important to have that aspect also covered. And when it comes to the general UN peacekeeping approach, then we believe that it is very important. This strays a little bit away from your particular question. It is very important to be in a situation whereby we would look at a particular operation with very clearly and recognize above all to ourselves what are the complications and what are the needs of that particular operation, so that the mandates would be drawn according to what is needed. In our case, it's also very important to know what is the ROEs, what are the rules of engagement of a particular mission. And again, different situations demand very different rules of engagement. So we don't believe you would need to stereotype these operations. And this is all in the protection of the local population, but also to protect our own troops in those complicated situations. Because I think we have to keep in mind that we have strayed from traditional peacekeeping, not because we want it, but because the security situation has simply changed. And we are dealing often, we keep peace in what are failed states, where there are no clear dividing lines, where there is no line to keep peace, actually. Well, Lebanon is different. I mean, there you have a very clear mandate. It's much more classical peacekeeping operation. But otherwise, you are really in the midst of it, in the thick of it. And how you operate in that environment is for us very important, because also we don't want anybody to go outside the mandate or try to, be creative. I think it's the responsibility of the politicians to make those decisions, and not to say to soldiers, well, you go in there, I'm sure you can somehow, do it. Don't ask too many questions or something like that. I think that's exactly the wrong approach. We have to be ready to give a mandate which is necessary and be politically also brave to make those difficult decisions.
Shirley?
Shirley Chesney,
Well,
Peace Action. I was very interested in your comment about the split in Estonia between the Ministry of Economy and Defense. I'm not clear, is there a significant portion of the economy now devoted to security? How could you explain more of whether you're dependent on outside trade and protection for your weaponry, whether it's your defense is indigenous to Estonia, or whether it's connected with what happens through UN peacekeeping or with your allies?
As you said, there are very different levels of risks and different ways and means to protect. Obviously, one of the classical scenarios is that somebody attacks your civilian infrastructure, power stations or air traffic control or stuff like that. It hasn't been really done properly because it also needs a fairly sophisticated machinery to do that. It's not just that you come about and start attacking a power station. But this is something which we consider civilian infrastructure, and it is protected by a special agency, which is under the Ministry of Economy, which is the RIA is whatever special cyber defense agency. But then, as I said, our ministry deals with defense aspects. And what are the most vulnerable defense assets? These are usually communications networks, networks to exchange data. These will be the first under attack when something would happen. The other challenge is, of course, that today's military, perhaps there is a difference between the military of the Cold War and military of today, they also use a lot of civilian infrastructure. We have very few special military airfields or ports, especially in our neck of the woods. So basically, a civilian infrastructure can also be potentially a military threat or threat to our military, for instance, in moving troops. The railway systems, the port systems, which are classically not so well protected as pure military installations.
A fellow journalist, Minister.
Good morning. Very pleased to hear your...
Malik, introduce yourself, please.
Sorry. Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. Thank you for this very enlightening presentation. My question relates to the overall defense in Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, after her not so pleasant meeting with US President Trump, spoke of, she used the words, "We got to defend ourselves." What is your reading of that? And is it a viable proposition? And could you also expand on the long-term implications for US leadership? Thank you.
Well, when it comes to collective defense, the defense of the European territory, for instance, then it is only doable with the strong participation of the United States. So the transatlantic relationship in both political realm and defense realm is of crucial importance to everybody in Europe. The fact is that because of some risks, like the risk of Russia, we are simply incapable of defending ourselves on our own. It's not, the question is not in will or not even in defense spending, but it's simply the sheer volume, the sheer magnitude of military capabilities which the US possesses and which we cannot replicate even if we decide to go on our own in some ways. So I think I'm not commenting on any Merkel statement, but simply, broadly speaking, going on our own when it comes to collective defense is unrealistic. And it's not necessary. I mean, I had just a meeting 2 weeks ago with Secretary Mattis, and it is clear that the United States stays deeply involved in European defense matters. You know that Congress has approved something which is called EDI, European Deterrence Initiative, which distributes over $4 billion for the defense of Europe, which is a serious sum of money. There is an increased presence of US troops on the European territory, including in Poland, for instance. So I don't see any risk of decoupling. Obviously, this relationship should be nurtured, as all political relationships. And next week, the 3 Baltic presidents, in fact, will be meeting with President Trump in Washington, and they will also be giving a press conference, the 4 of them, afterwards.
Okay. Well, this gentleman right here in the middle. Maybe I'll take 2 or 3 at once since we're kind of getting close to time. So, gentleman in the back after he's through, and then maybe this gentleman here. We'll take 3 at once, okay?
Sure. Philip Sasek from Network 2020. Thank you so much for sharing with us your insights. Just a very short question to kind of expand on one of your answers. The rules of engagement in conventional warfare are somewhat clear. What are the rules of engagement in the cyber level? Thank you.
And the second question in the back.
Good morning, Shai Franklin, a consultant. To follow up on the interplay between the European Union and NATO, the security dimension, do you see or are you concerned about any overflow from EU tensions into the NATO sphere? For example, sanctions on Poland, Brexit tensions, things like that. Thank you.
And then here in the second row.
Thank you. Angio of Bulgarian mission. Thank you, Minister, for your insights. I'm following on the questions on cybersecurity. It's evident that the use of connected technologies, internet in civilian infrastructure, defense infrastructure is pretty much a must, and every country does it. However, the advanced use of internet technologies in e-government and in particular elections, as you pointed out, it's pretty unique. So having in mind that Estonia may be more exposed to cyber attacks, is the risk worth it? And do you think you or anyone could be prepared for future attacks that may not be crude, as you said, but more sophisticated and better organized? Thank you.
Can you take those three?
Okay. First, about the rules of engagement in the cybersphere. I mean, it's a great question, and obviously the answer is no. These issues have not been hashed out. Or let me be more precise. There is a Tallinn Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which works with those issues. And they have published something which is called the Tallinn Manual. There are 2 volumes of that already, whereby in preparing those documents, well-recognized experts on international law and cyber defense experts have come together and tried to replicate some of the international comment we have about warfare in other domains to the cyber domain. You immediately face myriad of questions which are not similar to any other domain. No country has actually started in writing any kind of convention or international agreement on that issue, because it's still a very fluid question, very much in the academic sphere of discussions. But I think these manuals provide the first kind of body of legal thinking, which hopefully will develop into a somewhat more concrete agreements or international covenants where countries could put their signature on. But this will be extremely difficult. Obviously, it has to be kept in mind that when we say, well, cyber defense, cyber attack, we sometimes are not able to recognize the enormous human suffering which such an attack can create. Because if you go after the civilian infrastructure, you can basically take out hospitals, I don't know, blood banks, civilian air traffic control. You can do so much damage that it can become a real humanitarian catastrophe. So some of these issues in addressing the issue of civilian victims and collateral damage are as potent in cyber sphere as they are in ordinary military sphere. So this is still work in progress. Now to the question about EU tensions and their relationship with NATO. I mean, if I would give you a legal, formalistic answer, then it's no. I mean, It's obvious that these are two separate organizations with very clear mandates, which have different sources. But in real life, obviously, both tensions with Poland and Brexit, they all play a role. Now, what role they play is another question. For instance, I just hosted the British defense minister in Estonia, and he made a very important point. He said that the presence of British troops in Estonia, which is happening under NATO chapeau, is actually something which proves that while Britain leaves European Union, it doesn't leave Europe, and it will focus even more on NATO, because that is now the framework in Europe where they can operate. So the presence of those troops on our territory has become kind of a symbolic sign of the fact that Britain is not leaving Europe. And there was one on cyber attacks. I couldn't quite catch it. You said that they become even more complicated?
Yes, the thing is, the previous attack you both referred to, you described as being crude. What about in the future, if the attacks could be more sophisticated?
There's no doubt that the future attacks will be more sophisticated. But of course, the defensive capabilities nowadays are also much more sophisticated. So consequently, it will still be quite difficult. And I would say Estonia is extremely well protected when it comes to cyber, and we have cooperation, deep level of contacts and cooperation agreements with some of the major allied powers like the United States, like France, because we think we still have a lot to offer also to other allies when it comes to expertise on these matters.
Thank you all for your attention and your good questions, and thank you, Minister, in particular, for coming to IPI.
Thank you very much.